Welcome to the FarmBits podcast, a product of Nebraska Extension Digital Agriculture. I'm Jackson Stansel.
And I'm Samantha Teaton, and we come to you each week to discuss the trends, the realities, and the value of digital agriculture.
Through interviews and panels with experts, producers, and innovators from all sectors of digital technology, we hope that you step away from each episode with new practical knowledge of digital agriculture technology. Welcome back to the FarmBits podcast for this third episode in our planting series.
As you listen to our planting series, please take the time to fill out the survey linked in our show notes to provide feedback on the content and format of the FarmBits podcast.
In the first episode of this series, Don Beatty offered a perspective on planting operations and technology. And in the second episode, we discussed multi-hybrid planting and the theory behind seeding prescription generation with Rachel Stevens.
In this episode, we want to highlight a commercially available platform that offers seeding prescriptions, hybrid recommendations, and data aggregation technology.
Our guests for this episode are Matt Lau and Morrison Jacobs of the Climate Corporation. Matt is a global product manager for Climate's scripting division, and Morrison is Climate's corn modeling lead.
Together, Matt and Morrison provide a comprehensive perspective of Climate's offerings, particularly for seeding prescriptions and hybrid selection technologies.
In this episode, we discuss the methods behind Climate's seeding prescriptions, how Climate is leveraging their relationship with Bayer to enable smarter hybrid recommendations through aggregated data, and what technology they are looking forward to bringing to the table to address farmers' challenges in the future.
This episode offers a detailed look at a popular commercial platform used on many farms today. So let's get started with this interview with Matt and Morrison. Well, thanks for joining us. And do you mind telling us a little bit about yourselves and your role at Climate? And I don't know, whichever one of you wants to start.
I'll go first. All right, since Matt wasn't offering. All right, so I'm Morrison Jacobs. I'm part of the science organization within Climate where I lead corn modeling. So these are the teams of people that are actually building the predictive agronomic models that show up as digital recommendations inside of FieldView. A little bit about myself. I've pretty much spent my entire career building or leading teams that develop decision science models through various organizations within R&D at what is now Bayer. I like to think of the work that we're doing today in Climate as very similar to Moneyball did for baseball. Instead of finding the optimal roster of players, we're trying to find the optimal portfolio of products for a grower's operation. Instead of placing those players into the ideal positions, we think about it as distribution of seed within a field. Where they were looking at analytics on how to manage a player's plate appearance, as an example. We tried to do the exact same thing, except that we're thinking about it from the terms of management recommendations on things like crop protection decisions.
Gotcha.
Matt, how about you? Yep, I'm Matt Lau. I am the product manager for our FieldView seed scripting services. So I work with our science teams, in particular, Morrison's corn modeling team, and many other teams all around the world in all of our regions that we have our science products enabled. And I take the discovery that the science group makes and put that into a product that users, such as dealers and growers, are able to use to execute. And in particular, FieldView Seed Scripts is my focus, which is our advanced scripting tool that takes takes the corn information that we have that Morrison's team generates and makes it usable for our growers.
Awesome. So for anybody who's unfamiliar with the Climate Corporation and what exactly the platform is, Morrison, would you mind going into kind of an overview of the objectives and features of the platform and just kind of tell us about how growers are using it this time of year?
Actually, I'll hand that one off to Matt, since as the product owner, Matt is much more into the grower side of things.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Morrison. So the Climate Corporation is a data science company at its heart, and it is the digital farming arm of Bayer Crop Science. Our product is FieldView. So you'll hear us say Climate and Climate Corporation is FieldView. FieldView is the product that the Climate Corporation has, which is on more than 150 million subscribed acres worldwide, which is about 20 countries worldwide.
Wow.
Some of our mission is to make farming easier. So make the connection between trusted advisors, the retail network, easier with their customers, their growers, and bring them digital tools that allows them to use their data to drive better decisions. Some features this time of year, so there's several. So we're still in the winter, so it feels like in St. Louis it's 72 here, so not much longer in the winter. But analysis of the previous season is still being done in some areas. So taking a look at what happened last year, but more importantly for scripting as a whole and planning. It's an extremely important time of year for planning and creating those scripts with your growers and your retailers. But something we also are working really hard to do right now is get the FieldView cab, which is our data collection tool, get those accounts set up, get the hybrids into the platform, get growers ready to go out there and do some application and do some planting, some fertilizing, get everything ready so when they get to the field, they're not having to spend time worrying about typing things in correctly, where they can do it when they have some time in the office in the winter.
Mm-hmm. It is our understanding that you guys, really take farmer ideas and their thoughts into the design of your product. We know that from the growers that we work with. So can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you are hearing from producers, and how is Climate and the product FieldView working to overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, I'll start and I'll talk about some of the challenges that I know of, and then we'll have Morrison talk about several things that he's heard. But a big part of problems growers have is they create a plan, and more often than not, that plan gets disrupted by weather or by some event. And in many instances, they may not have a plan B or a plan C. Some of the biggest challenges that we hear are helping growers provide or create better plans, and then also around seed placement, allowing them to have more flexible hybrids in case those plans change, where they're not able to execute the best option. They have a more flexible second choice that they can use in those fields. And then in particular to where I work, or what I focus on with the FieldView seed scripts, give them better opportunities to create backup scripts. So when we create a FieldView seed scripts, it's very particular to a hybrid. We have the grower select a hybrid because we understand how that hybrid interacts with population. But it takes some time to create one script with one hybrid. And if we gave them an option to create multiple scripts at once to increase the amount of fields they can do at one single time, such as batching, it'll give them options to have those backup prescriptions ready for them.
Yeah, thinking about that question, there's probably a lot of underlying questions that need to be answered as you kind of lead up to a farmer making a decision on planting. Through the years, especially in the science organization, I spend a lot of time working with our FieldView Innovators group, as well as our research partners. And I think the one common theme for me that shows up is that not all farmers are the same, and certainly don't want to be treated the same, is the one that just resonates for me a lot. Because, as there's lots of decisions, those decisions are generally unique based off of circumstances. And so, if I have to translate it based off of essentially what Matt just said, it's really around having flexibility and being able to understand the impact that a decision is going to make. And so Matt highlighted one, just around scripting. I also like to think around the economics that are built into that, that growers like to model the impacts of different seed costs, grain sale prices, yield, and seeding rates, and what that impact is going to have on their decision. The other one that's actually coming up more recently and even louder is just the concept of sustainability. I like to think of sustainability. It's interesting. It's like fresh baked apple pie, right? It smells great to everyone and everyone wants a slice, but it can be very overwhelming on really where to start and what kind of options do they have, and how do they take advantage of what's out there from sustainability practices.
Sure. So, you kind of mentioned that farmers like to be treated differently at the very least, and a lot of farmers are different. But at the same time, we know that there are a lot of factors that kind of go into what influences the growth of a plant and the growth of a crop overall. So when you go into make seeding prescriptions, particularly from the climate perspective, what are some of the critical data layers that are the same across a multitude of operations for those decisions?
Yeah, so I'll work on this one. So there's several different avenues. So within FieldView, we have several scripting options. So I spoke to FieldView seed scripts previously, which is our premium, our advanced option. We also have what we call manual scripting. And this manual scripting is, it's a very simple process that we give growers the options to use several predefined sets of zones, which could be Sergo zone layers, or if they have a previous set of zones that a trusted advisor created for them, they could import those in as well and use those. And that manual scripting uses whatever zones they provide, but then gives them the flexibility to use whichever hybrid they want and assign whatever rate they would like to that hybrid. So it's really a blank slate that we provide a little bit of the hard work. We do a little bit of the hard work for them and let them make all the decisions themselves. And then when you look at FieldView seed scripts, there's some critical data layers that are involved there where we are actually taking their data that they have in their FieldView account and generating zones automatically for them. So critical data layers that are included in FieldView seed scripts are their yield layers. So including their previous crop history yield layers is extremely important. But then also imagery layers. So our Field Health Advisor tool, which is our satellite imagery tool, is also a method that we can use to generate zones for FieldView seed scripts if yield layers are not available. And looking at both of those options, we then take the best option, the one that expresses the most variability within the field, and provide that as their base set of zones. So yeah, accurate yield layers and field health layers. So within that process, we also give the growers the option to deselect layers. So if a grower did a trial in one field where they might have sprayed part of the field with a fungicide, or they might have had two very different hybrids, and one had an issue with lodging or green snap, and that yield layer was not accurate, we give them the ability to deselect those layers. So knowing those critical years that something might have impacted their crop and having them remove those layers, those are all critical components.
Yep. Absolutely.
That's interesting.
The deselection aspect, I think, is actually really important. I mean, coming from the research angle ourselves, I mean, and dealing with management, so that's certainly something that we have to take into account. So it's not easy to do. So it's great that you're taking care of that for growers and allowing them to do that.
So thinking about hybrids now, typically, a grower will work with their sales rep or a consultant and decide what hybrids should be placed on their field, but you guys are collecting a lot of data. And how are you leveraging that data to maybe make even more informed decisions on where hybrids should be placed on a farm?
Oh, I love that question. So I'll jump into this. I guess first thing to note is, our ability to do hybrid selection or placement is still a pilot, and ever expanding. That being said, I also know that one of our competitive advantages within climate is our ability to leverage the combination of data that we get from farmers, as well as our data that we get from Bayer R&D. A large percentage of growers today run trials on their farms every year. Now, these types of split planted or split field trials that compare products allow us to add millions and millions of data points around product performance every year. And it really does span, key growing areas and covering a variety of different management factors. The flip side of that then is we've got this connection back to Bayer R&D that allows us to pull in more than 10 years of historical performance from breeding and market development trials. Interestingly enough, both of these organizations have actually undergone their own digital transformations over the last number of years. So we've now got digital phenotyping or characterization of product performance within those networks where they're leveraging drones to collect new types of data. But it is kind of on the forefront of a lot of the research that they do. At the same time, it's interesting that the largest field testing location in the world is actually now at a Bayer R&D facility inside of Chesterfield, Missouri, where they essentially fingerprint every one of the products the same way you would for 23andMe. We do it for all of our products. And so now being able to connect all that digital phenotyping data with now that molecular data and being able to connect it up with all the multiple types of environment data like weather and soils, it's really just an example of how this combined set of insights give us an understanding or predictive performance around new products as well as our current products.
Sure. So you've mentioned that you're getting, at least a set of these data points from the on-farm research trials that farmers are running out there in their own fields. Does FieldView offer the opportunity to, I guess, kind of facilitate creating those rate block prescriptions and validating the accuracy of those seeding prescriptions, kind of in return for that data that is coming from farmers' fields?
Matt, did you want to jump into that?
Yeah, I'll hop in on that. So there is a little bit of, there's a couple different parts to that. So when we're doing some research trials where we are looking at those seeding rates, we may not be using, we may be using other tools, but when growers are using FieldView, they have the option to easily place those trial blocks into their prescription, whether it is a rectangle or a square. They have that ability to easily place that block within an area of the field, assign a different rate to it. For instance, if they believe the rate should be higher or the rate should be lower, they can assign a different rate to it and carry that on through planting and then on through harvest, and then use tools like our field region report, which is a tool that can be used on a subfield level. So you essentially have the ability to draw an area of a field and analyze the yield within that subsection of the field. Now, what that means for testing prescriptions and testing trial areas of the field, it gives you that option to draw an area right next to that trial area where the script recommended one rate, and then draw another field region report alongside it or within that trial area that the grower placed, and have them measure the yield in that area. And it gives them a yield in both of those, and they can make those decisions on their own.
I'll just ladder off of what Matt just said. I think Matt just laid out a really nice way of how we can assess trials today. I do want to call out that we're actually in the process of making it even easier to run robust on-farm experiments. So there's enhancements to what Matt just described that we're working on that will make it actually simpler to set up, execute, and analyze trial results. We really hope that those types of enhancements will really provide a deeper understanding of the management decisions that growers are actually running and that they want to optimize themselves. So stay tuned for that, because I think that's going to be a really exciting change.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. That is exciting that you guys are really incorporating that, but that can also come with some challenges, right? If you're aggregating a lot of data from these growers, we've heard from some other podcast interviews that a challenge is that farmers will just want to put in nitrogen instead of saying what the actual nitrogen source was, or they maybe just say corn, they don't see the hybrid. How are you able to clean all of that to make accurate aggregated data?
Sure, I'll jump into that one.
Okay.
That one's kind of an interesting one. As I mentioned, climate, we're at the benefit of having millions and millions of acres of data points.
Yeah.
And so the interesting thing is you start pulling some of these trials together because we can aggregate data over millions of data points. Some of what you just described, the noise, simply gets washed out. It certainly will translate into the accuracy of a recommendation we can make. And so we've actually got teams of folks that actually focus purely just on data quality. In fact, we've separated them out into, how do we collect machine data and understand the accuracy of that machine data as it's coming in, whether it's understanding the performance of a yield monitor, understanding when things are or not calibrated, or understanding when may not have accuracy in, like you just gave an example of, maybe a product name, and how we need to aggregate the data differently as a result of the quality of the data that's coming in.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that's something that we've seen, and certainly as far as data quality goes. But I'm also interested in kind of digging in a little bit more on the kind of the data streams that you have coming together, right? So you have weather data that you said that you're kind of bringing in a lot of different ways. You've got imagery data that's coming in. You have mobile machinery data. How much of an advantage is it all the APIs that you've put together to be able to synthesize all these different data layers? I mean, we even saw that one of our former guests, Corey Wilmus and Swap Maps, is now kind of an API partner that's, I guess, like a management zone. So I would just love for you to expand on your API integrations a little bit.
Yeah, I'll talk to what I know, and I don't work extremely close with all of our API partners. We have another group within Climate that does that, but the APIs are extremely critical for managing those relationships between the trusted advisors, the growers, all of the OEMs, and within Climate. So we are all trying to make farming easier and make better decisions and provide growers with a more useful tool to do their job at the end of the day. And we have a significant amount of APIs, and many of them are tailored to all different types of operations and things growers want to execute on, whether it is, like you said, zone management, or an imagery provider, or just an OEM that is sharing data with growers' permission back to FieldView to have in their account. So it's APIs are extremely important now, and they're going to be even more important as we move into more digital opportunities and provide growers the ability to stay more connected.
Yeah, I think maybe just laddering off of that, it'd just be around compatibility, right? The more that we have enhanced compatibility across every type of equipment, whether it's the as applied equipment, planters, harvesting equipment, the better the data that we can assemble. And so think about your previous question. You know, if we only get planting data and no harvest data, it's tough to generate a lot of insights. If we get planting and harvest, but we get none of the as applied information, you know, you've got a lot of confounding features. So the more that we build out our compatibility across the entire end-to-end decision cycle that growers have, the better we're going to have recommendations in the future.
Sure.
And also on this, like, completing the bigger picture thing, you guys touched on this a little bit earlier, the Bayer R&D research, but how does that partnership help in other ways too? So I'm sure it's helpful to them or, you know, helpful to Bayer research of maybe providing some direction, but it also gives you guys some database, right? You said before, I think that you had like the 10 years of data on that hybrid. So can you talk about how that working together in these two different avenues within one company is really beneficial?
I think that's a great question. It really is mutually beneficial. I think there's a lot of aggregated information that we can share backwards that really help us understand the performance of products differently than we have before, as well as being able to pull in and analyze a lot of the data that they have in research trials. I think the interesting thing, at least for us at Climate, was because we had this desire to connect our data and product performance all the way from a grower's field backwards to market development. Market development, you know, is working hand in hand with our growers running large scale strip trials. And then we've got our R&D, our research and development area, where, you know, in a lot of cases, they're small plots, right? Small plots that you'd run at universities, or maybe smaller plots inside of growers' fields. It's actually more difficult than you would expect to be able to connect that entire stream of data from what's happening in a grower's field and all the way backwards, and try and do it across multiple years. And so there's a lot of shifts that we even had to make inside the company to be able to do it. As you just asked the question around APIs and compatibility, we had to do that same type of API and compatibility just internally in the company on how we all talk to each other. Here's the one thing that I absolutely love about it, though, is that, as we're aggregating data from grower fields to really understand how they're planting products, how they're trying to manage them to optimize yield, we were able to help our R&D colleagues understand what shifts maybe they had to make in how they were testing products.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about, we talk about the national average of corn being 175 bushels. It's an average. Well, guess what? There's people at both extremes. And when you're trying to build and test products from the start, we always lean to the middle and try and think of the average. And so what we were able to do, because now we can summarize data from FieldView in a different way, is provide guidance on, well, you know what? Growers in Nebraska, as an example, here's the seeding rate ranges that they're actually planting your product at. And actually shifting the design field research that sits underneath it to match that, to understand, is it really performing the way we expect it? And so, one of the things I can point to directly is, we've actually shifted trials in Nebraska so that we can test under irrigated and non-irrigated conditions, really variable rate, and understanding how products perform differently, how seeding rates perform differently. So we can pull that information into models now and give a better recommendation to growers in that area.
That's really, really cool. I mean, how targeted that is. But Nebraska, as you mentioned, is in a very unique position where a lot of the state is irrigated. And essentially everybody out there is, varying their seed in dry land corners versus the irrigated areas. So I think that's a really good choice. I mean, so we've talked a lot about seeding rates and hybrids. I'm curious, are you doing any research as well on seed treatments and how those interact with different hybrids and kind of using aggregated data in that way as well?
I guess I'll jump into this one. So crop protection is obviously the next area. When you think of where a digital recommendation needs to go for a grower, just kind of think of the time frames. When we go to a grower and have conversations around research trials, it's usually in the fall time. And the way it used to show up on a grower's field is you get 3 or 4 different sales calls. Well, one person to come and talk about seeds. Maybe you get a couple of different brands showing up. Someone's going to start showing up around chemistry. And that's going to show up. And so like all these different sales calls. And so for us, when I think of kind of the digital recommendation, it's really got to span that entire gamut, and we want to do it all at once. And so absolutely, crop protection is the next thing. And we are doing a lot of research, again, with our market development colleagues, as well as you may have heard of this Delaro pilot that we've run in some areas of the country, really trying to understand fungicide and fungicide performance. And how do we create better return on investment for growers, as well at the same time thinking about actual seed growth of the seed treatment at the same time. And now actually venturing out a little bit more back to that sustainability piece around herbicides. And how do we get smarter about where and when we're going to apply herbicides?
I've been trying to kind of follow the train of this aggregated data, and I think you brought up sustainability a couple times now, and it's brought to mind biologicals, right, and how biologicals are starting to change. I don't know. I don't really have a well-formulated question here, but I am curious as to how you consider biologicals coming into space as being a potential change to what you're doing, or how it might impact how you're making some of these decisions, whether it's on the seeding front or if it's on, more of your nitrogen management tools as well.
Okay, I think there's probably a couple of pieces in here. So maybe Matt and I will both probably have to unpack this one a little bit.
Okay, sounds good.
So from a research standpoint, it's like everything. You're trying to isolate the effect that whatever product it is, whether it's the actual seed product or the seeding rate or a treatment being applied to a field, what does that actually have in terms of yield response? So biologics is exactly the same way. The trick is really just having enough of that data that you can actually see a response that's going to be above the noise that you actually get back from many experiments. I'm sure you all can probably point to a bunch of different biologics products that are out there today. And they all have a variety of different efficacies and responses depending on where they're tested. And that's what makes them a little bit trickier. right? To really understand where they're going to perform really, really well, or where they're going to be more neutral. And so for that, I think it kind of goes back to some of those pieces that Matt touched on around, setting up experiments really well. I'm testing to make sure what works well or doesn't work well on a very specific field, because all fields are going to be a little bit different in this. I will just say, we have a lot of research and R&D where, our biotech division is building out new biologics products. Where, similarly to what I've already said, seeds, seeding rate, the actual product itself, working on crop protection, biologics would fall in there as well.
I guess I don't have anything specific. You touched on it very well. Like I said previously, there are many opportunities to do trials with prescriptions. We have fertility prescriptions, crop protection prescriptions, which biologicals could fall into that camp. I encourage growers to test and test often, and have an unbiased view of what those results are. And also over multiple years, I've seen many instances where starter fertilizer or additions to starter fertilizer have a really, really great response in 1 year, and then they never test it again after that and have no idea how that might change in a different environment. So continue to test and continue to challenge what you know as accurate.
I think we're going to move a little bit into the hardware side. I don't know how much you guys can speak to this, so feel free. But how does like the Climate FieldView and some of that work with different types of tractors? How does the movement of prescriptions or even that data back to you all work with different setups, different companies? How do you get past some of that?
Yeah, I'll touch on this, and there's a lot to it. So we'll start with what I know best in prescriptions and how transferring prescriptions works within FieldView and the CAB app, and then how prescriptions in general has worked in the past. And for prescription execution, the final mile has always been the biggest challenge. That mile from the office to the actual cab of the tractor. And when the tractor's in the shop next to the office, it's much shorter mile, and it's usually not as hard. But if they have an operation that's 40 miles away from a field of 40 miles away from the office, it's a much bigger challenge to get that data moved around. So we have several avenues of working with growers, and the most common is with our partnership with Precision Planting and their 2020 monitors. So the FieldView CAB app is our data collection tool. It's our iPad app that connects to a Precision Planting 2020 or the FieldView Drive, as we own that component. And for the 2020, we have the ability to send prescriptions down to the display itself. And so the wireless connectivity, the cellular connectivity of the iPad transfers that prescription from the computer to the iPad, and then through the cable to the 2020, that's transferred. So it's an excellent opportunity to easily move those prescriptions around. And if for some reason something might change last minute, it'll take 15 minutes to make a prescription change and then have that updated onto the CAB app, which then goes to the 2020. We also work closely with several API partners, and we're always growing that as well to integrate into other OEMs platforms where we can send prescriptions to, and if they're part of that platform, they can wirelessly transmit to their OEM displays in the cab. The other half of that question, I believe, was data collection. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I touched on the FieldView Drive. I spoke about the Precision Planting 2020, and essentially what these tools are is a catalyst to get the equipment data, so the planting, the application, the harvest data from the machine itself onto the iPad, which is then connected to the cloud, whether through cellular or Wi-Fi connection, which then brings the data up to the grower's FieldView account, the grower's climate account. And from there, they can look at that data. They can get reports on yield and performance. They can do field region reports. They can do many, many things with that. We also use what we call the data inbox, which is a method that we take the data off the machine, whether it's a USB or we have API partners, and we move that data in through our data inbox, which allows them to get that data that isn't compatible with the drive or the cab app, get that data into their account so they can have all of those layers available to them and be able to make the best decisions possible.
So it sounds like you kind of have a lot of the data transfer piece, figured out. And from my understanding, that's what a lot of farmers really love about FieldView is the ability to aggregate that data so easily and have it be essentially either the touch of a button or even no touch of a button at all. And so I think that side of things is great. But with you bringing up that precision planting aspect, we're going to have precision planting on in this series and to kind of talk about new planter technologies. And so one thing that I'm curious about is as you're building these seeding prescriptions, how are you kind of adapting to the new planter capabilities, whether that be multi-hybrid or the ability to adjust seeding rates on the go using smart foamers and things like that some of the planter companies are coming out with right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the new technologies from precision planting, the smart foam technology is fantastic and is a new take on looking at what's underneath the soil without having to do soil tests. I'm really excited about seeing that and how we can start integrating some of that data. And like we talked about before, all of that requires testing and assessing within our group, how do we fit that into our models to make those zone recommendations? And that's something we're working on. It's something that we are we're looking at how we can integrate those layers that growers may have into the model. And that'll be future years down the road. In more short term, we are also looking at the opportunity to allow growers to take those layers and use those layers to manage their variability by making zones off those layers for a manual script. So they can use that for fertility or crop protection or whatever they'd like to do. So we're still developing the tools once we have a more robust set of data from those technologies.
So yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm glad that you're saying that you need to test it first before just taking the smart foamers at their word, because that's one of the huge risks, right? If you have a lot of real-time data coming in, it's not calibrated per se, and potentially being used to make decisions. And I guess Morrison, maybe you can speak to that a little bit coming from the modeling side. That's a huge challenge with real-time data, right?
It is real-time data. When you think about it, the application really means dynamic scripting on the fly, right? And so just think about decisions that you would have to make as the planter is moving along at speed, and being able to have all the equipment talk to each other is actually, from an IoT perspective, when people talk about it, is a little bit of next generation.
Yeah.
Right. You're taking information, especially just think of where a firmer is placed on the equipment. It's already in furrow at the back.
Yeah.
Right. And so by the time it would have to connect back up to a seed meter to change something to a script, right, you've actually got a little bit of a disconnect. Right. So you're making a decision in the past,
right,
not for the future. Right.
Not predictive at all. Yeah.
And so there's actually going to have to probably be a little bit of a leap in terms of some shifts in how we actually think about the equipment itself. I think some of the things I'm actually a little bit more excited about as well are some of the robotic planters that are starting to show up on the scene that are not having to plant at speed, right? They're almost planting themselves, and they can go a little bit slower, right? And so actually probably is maybe a step of where we might get to in the future. But I think it's a great call out. You're right. There's new data coming in all the time. I think that's what we all need to be aware of. And it's now just how valuable is that data and how does that data apply to the decisions we want to make?
Sure.
And what other challenges exist about the current data that we have? When you talked about earlier how Surgo is really common, but that's a high resolution. It's at an upper level type thing versus, sensors would be a lot lower or higher resolution. And so how would some of those things, the frequency at which it's coming in, how does that really change the recommendations?
A lot, depending on what they are, actually. It kind of depends on the data layer you're talking about, because there's a variety of different resolutions, right? Look, your great example there of Surgo. Surgo comes at an interesting resolution, and a lot of the Surgo data is relatively historical and old and still being updated every year, compared to a grower soil sample. And I think Matt touched on this earlier. That's actually one of the valuable pieces inside of FieldView, allowing growers to upload their own soil test information, and then if they need to, actually create zones or scripts based off of that information relative to Surgo. Behind the scenes, from a modeling and analytics perspective, there's mechanisms for us to merge those different types of data sets at different resolutions, which is, again, as we start moving into this day of artificial intelligence, some of the new machine learning methods allow a lot of this to happen much easier today than it did just a couple of years ago. The compute horsepower that was required to do that several years ago, outside of, the government agencies, not as possible. However, today it is. And so we're constantly doing that type of what we would call fusion of data sets for our model building today.
Very cool. And so just kind of looking at where things are going in the future and kind of what we're excited about, to dig into your robotics example, this is something I find fascinating. How do you prepare for what those next steps are? Like how can you get ahead of the curve in terms of preparing the data types and data structures that you have available to actually fit the hardware that's going to be available in the next few years? I mean, that's a really dynamic challenge,
I think that's a good one. There's probably a lot to unpack there. So let's maybe touch on a couple of different pieces. I think the first one that comes to mind for me, honestly, is data quality. We brought it up a couple of times, and I know you all did as well. I can't tell you how many farms I've been on, operations, and talking about what have they learned on their fields, what type of experiments have they run. And it really runs the gamut in terms of how they actually document what's actually happened. Where we get, some of our farmers who've been farming the same land for 40 or 50 years, they can tell you what's happened on that field and kind of walk it like a storybook. The unfortunate part of that is when that storyteller is gone, how do you now maintain that history? Right. So being able to document it properly and being able to carry it forward in a digital experiment, so it's learnings on the field. We talk about personalized healthcare and personalized medicine. This is personalized prescriptions for a tailored field. This is what every grower wants from a digital perspective, right? And so having that type of information in the system in an easy way, that's why when we talk about experiments, it's hugely important. But then documenting what was in the experiment, right? What was the actual product you planted? What was the hybrid name? What was the treatment you ran? A lot of these things are sometimes lost. And so having those things documented along the same way. I think one of the other pieces that I heard probably in that comment is really like where this is going in the future. Coming from an ag background, we've had the green revolution. We can point to the benefits that it's had. We are absolutely in the digital revolution right now for agriculture. I see farmers able to get hundreds and hundreds of bushels an acre corn, higher than the national corn average inside of NCGA yield contests. I think for me, that actually just highlights how much more yield variability there actually is within a field that we're not taking advantage of today. So more than anything, I see farmers using these digital tools to test the performance of those inputs and identify ways to optimize their management practices. I think it's going to totally change how we capture data, how fast we capture data, the types of data we're going to capture. Just think of all the money that's being invested in ag today from all the startups. There's billions and billions of dollars. I think, as Matt talked about the API, you asked about API structure, the more that we're pulling in all that information from all those other folks into our recommendations, it's going to become more and more critical. So where I see things probably shifting more is the digital recommendations coming together as a tailored offering, right? Combining that hybrid, the seeding rate, the management, and crop protection from a variety of different perspectives. I think the other thing we didn't touch on actually, that we didn't mention earlier, is this shift in desire for new programs like outcome-based performance that really help farmers make their seed and chemistry choices with confidence. So it's more than just providing a data-driven recommendation. It's also around how we clearly and transparently demonstrate that value of the products to customers, and then actually ensure that that performance is delivered. I think that's the next connection that you're going to start seeing more and more of.
And how exactly do you do that? I mean, it's really hard to very clearly demonstrate value. I mean, especially in a variable rate situation where you don't necessarily have a baseline at that particular location where you implement. I mean, how are you able to demonstrate value and ROI of the product?
Yeah, a lot of that is going to touch on, what we brought up earlier around just getting the right experiments put in place. I think having, as we talked about earlier, that easy way to design an experiment and execute it on a field and then analyze it in what I would call a statistically relevant way. Yeah. That's the piece that unlocks it, right? Having the right control. If you're running an experiment, it's all about getting the right control into the field and then being able to manage it or measure the effect. And so that, again, that's one of the things I'm super excited about where Climate FieldView is going, because it's going to have that component to make it easier for growers.
Yeah, that's going to be awesome.
Can you expand a little bit on the future of where climate is going? You've mentioned the sustainability, and I'd love to hear a little bit about maybe how that's going to be incorporated into Climate's products, but any other things that you would like to touch on where you guys are going, which you have some, but I want to be sure we also touch on that sustainability piece.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk to some of the sustainability, and Morrison spoke on the outcome-based performance. But the sustainability is a very key focus for Bayer and Climate right now, with the carbon markets and everything that is evolving in that aspect. So we do have a program, or Bayer has a program that they are testing this year, where it encourages farmers to adopt new sustainable practices, and it's an extremely easy program to execute on. There's just a couple in this first year. There's a couple of sustainable practices that we're asking growers to adopt for a reward, a payment back on them adopting that, and that's a really big part of where we need to start shifting our resources. Is how do we do more with less, or how to do more with what we have, and how do we leave the field in a better position every year after harvest than when we got it before.
And I guess one part of that also is being able to quantify how those sustainability practices are actually impacting, carbon sequestration or some of these other things. Is that part of what Climate is going to be looking at as well, is kind of quantifying how much of an impact those sustainable practices are having on operations then?
Yeah, I mean, in the future, that's where we're hoping to go. So right now, the goal is to track and identify and provide an easy method to track. I know many growers who have filed the paperwork for some of the other sustainability programs, and it takes nearly a day or multiple days to fill in all of the forms every single year. But for growers who are using FieldView every day, and it's just part of the normal operation, they really don't have a whole lot of extra work to do. So it is not a deterrent when you have to since there isn't all that extra paperwork and all of those hoops to jump through, it is not as much of a deterrent to adopt these practices, and that's what we're hoping to get growers to do.
And how can our listeners learn more about the Climate Corporation? It sounds like you guys are on lots of acres, many people probably know, but if they are interested in potentially adopting it, or like I said, learning about some of these future technologies, where can they go to learn more?
Yeah, so there's several different avenues there. Climate.com is our website. We have a lot of information there. We also have a YouTube channel. It's the Climate Corporation, and there's hundreds of videos. We have many webinars on there that were recorded from previous seasons. We have the quick couple of minute tutorials. We have many customer testimonials on there as well. We also have a great podcast. So right after everybody subscribes to the FarmBits podcast, we encourage them to subscribe to the podcast called Around the Farm. That is our podcast that we've been doing for a couple of years now, and they touch on many different topics. Seed Scripts has been part of that. Carbon and other programs have been part of that as well. And it's a great podcast. It's only 20, 30 minutes long, and growers can listen to that and get some great information about what's going on. Other options, we have webinars, climate.com, and go to the event section. We have many webinars that are being given right now for getting set up for planting, or doing scripting, or in the fall, we're going to be talking about harvest and many other webinar sessions. Then also talk to your trusted advisor who's a FieldView dealer, and they would be able to help you with many things. And then we also have a great support line. You can contact us at our support section, and we can help you with any questions there.
Awesome. We'll make sure to link as many of those as we can in our show notes, and we'll try to do some publicity for the Around the Farm podcast with our listeners on our social media feeds. So
we appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we like to end every episode on one piece of advice from our guests. And so I'd love for each of you to offer a piece of advice that you have for our listeners who are exploring, really trying to put the right rate and the right hybrid in their fields and being more sustainable in their farm operations.
Yeah, I'll go first. Try FieldView Seed Scripts, experiment with the technology, run the trials. And if you don't agree with maybe some of the recommendations, put a trial area in there, test it with yourself, and but start with what you're comfortable with. The hardest part is getting started, and going from there is usually easier. So get started, try working towards a more precise solution on your operation, and you can use technology to do that.
I will echo what Matt just said. I love that answer. I'll just ladder off it and say, pay attention to the data quality. Running that proper experiment is making, it's good in, good out. We talked about a couple of attributes of having a good experiment, but don't forget about your equipment. Calibrate your planters, calibrate your harvest equipment, calibrate. If you really want to make a good data-driven decision, making sure that everything is accurate helps you get there. It sets you free.
Those are both fantastic pieces of advice, and things that we want our listeners to hear as much as possible, because that calibration piece is something that we've harped on a lot, and I think can never be overstated. So Thank you. Awesome.
Was there anything that we missed? Like I said, we're a little over time, but it's your guys' time that's we're worried about. So is there anything that we missed that you guys would like to still cover?
I did want to talk about looking into, if you are a first-time user of variable rate technology of any kind, assess your situation for your equipment first. It's important to have that partnership with your equipment dealer, and then also your FieldView representative. But if you're going to be trying variable rate scripts, whether it is fertility or seed or crop protection, assess your equipment's capabilities and identify whether or not you have the right unlocks on display. Many manufacturers have certain unlocks that are required to be able to execute different things that the display can do. So ensure, if you are doing this for the first time, ensure you have the right unlocks on your display. And then just get started.
Awesome. Thank you for catching that, because that's a piece that I think often goes, kind of forgotten about. I mean, it's something we talked about with like our on-the-go sensor-based nitrogen recommendations. A lot of people do not have the PWM nozzles or, even the variable orfics nozzles necessary to execute that type of stuff. And they're still trying to go out there and use it, and makes the technology look bad. Even the technology may be fine. It's just the equipment that's not well fit for it.
Yeah, and then even one step further, there's always support. So we have support@climate.com or support.climate.com, and then we have the support@climate.com email that you can reach out to our support team. There's a phone number, there's a live chat. There's many resources out there that can provide support for any question you have. Just reach out, and someone is very willing to help.
I'll say, not to sound like a commercial for you guys, but I know people who have called into the support and they're always very pleased, and you guys are prompt, and so yes, absolutely.
I'm glad to hear that.
Our support team those folks are just absolutely incredible. They will bend over backwards to help growers any way that they can to get their data in, get their equipment up and running. I always hear comments, around either dealers or someone from Climate heading out to someone's field to help calibrate some equipment because they just got something new and they want to make sure it was going to work right. We really will go and make sure, because it's important to all of us, right? Better data is good for everyone.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure service is part of the things that keep a company going. So I'm sure that's what has really attributed to your success. Thank you for joining us on that episode of the FarmBits podcast. As Matt mentioned, be sure to also subscribe to the Climates podcast Around the Farm if you enjoyed our content here. Mm-hmm. My favorite part of this episode was hearing about the mutually beneficial relationship between Bayer and Climate with the FieldView platform. So instead of just relying on plot-based research all of the time, they now have a very large database that can help inform decisions and make better products for their customers.
Yeah, that is a huge advantage to kind of have the phenotyping and genotyping side at Bayer, and then also have all the field data that's coming out of the Climate FieldView platform. Personally, I really enjoyed hearing about how Climate is already starting to explore integrating data from some of these new sensors that are on board today's planters to gain deeper insights into the fields that they're providing their recommendations to. So if you think about like the smart firmers that are on precision plantings devices, or any sensors that might be out there on other planters, these sensors are really enabling a lot more data from the field. And so the integrations that Climate is pursuing are really enabled by existing relationships and APIs that they already have with companies like Precision Planting through that data aggregation aspect of their platform. And I just think it's really interesting that they're already looking to integrate that data into the recommendations that they're offering, and even looking beyond what is available today to how that data may be used down the road with robotic planting technologies in the future as well.
Yeah, the value of those APIs cannot be overstated.
Absolutely. So with that, we hope you really enjoyed learning more about how the Climate Corporation can help make decisions at planting time. And we hope that you'll join us again next week for the next episode in our planting series. Thank you for taking the time to join us today on the FarmBits podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts to be informed about the latest content each week.
We welcome your feedback, so if you have comments or questions for us, please reach out to us over email, on Twitter, or in the review section of your favorite podcast platform. Our contact information can also be found in the show notes.
We would like to thank Nebraska Extension for their support of this podcast and their commitment to providing high-quality informational material to members of the agricultural community in Nebraska and beyond.
The opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the views of Nebraska Extension or the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
We look forward to you joining us next week for another episode of FarmBits.